are some of the most common autoimmune diseases you see today?
I mean, people come to me, with all kinds of pre-existing diagnoses. I get people that come to see me with rheumatological disease like rheumatoid arthritis and dermatomyositis and lupus and ankylosing spondylitis, psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis, Hashimoto's thyroid diseases, celiac disease, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. So kind of the gambit. Autoimmune disease is fastly becoming one of the biggest causes of death. It's actually arguably the biggest cause of death. It is the number one cause of death in women under the age of 65. But unfortunately, the way statistics are done in medicine, autoimmune disease, there's more than 100 forms. So instead of saying autoimmune disease kills X amount of people, we say rheumatoid arthritis was responsible for this many deaths. Hashimoto's was responsible for this many deaths, et cetera. Unlike cancers, where we group all the cancers together, unlike heart disease, where we group all forms of heart disease or cardiovascular disease together, we don't do that with autoimmune disease. So in my opinion, if we really crunch the numbers properly, we would find that autoimmune disease is the most likely the top cause of death in industrialized nations, including the US.
That's staggering to hear. And I think there's still at least mainstream publicly understood information. There's such little information understood about autoimmune disease. Yet so many people are experiencing these diseases. And as you said, there's more than 100 forms of autoimmune diseases. What are the main causes of most autoimmune diseases, and why have they skyrocketed in the past few decades?
Well, I think one of the biggest causes in what got me into it originally was gluten. Gluten sensitivity is a much more pervasive issue than what we ever believed, 20, 30, 40 years ago. As a matter of fact, gluten, we only discovered the cause of celiac disease, in 1952. So, Dr. William Dickey, a Dutch pediatrician, discovered that during World War II, during grain rations, that all the kids in his hospital with celiac disease went into spontaneous remission. And so it was his observation very keenly that led us to discover that gluten causes autoimmune disease, in this case, celiac disease. But it was not just his work, but additional researchers that came, after him that pointed and shone a big headlight on how gluten can cause many forms of autoimmune disease, and that gluten sensitivity is related to a lot of them. So my original observation, 20 years ago in clinical practice, I actually studied in the VA hospital in the rheumatology department. And, my fellow veterans were coming in, with rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, a varying different and sundry of autoimmune arthritides. And what I found and what was frustrating is everybody got methotrexate, which is an anti-cancer medication that is also used to diminish pain in autoimmune arthritis, or everybody got steroid injections. This was before the biologics were widely available as they are today. But nobody ever really got better. Their pain would be reduced, but then they would be back. And so what we would see is people being on these meds for 5 years, 10 years, their joints would still be destroyed. And now they were sending them over to the surgeon for full-blown joint replacement surgery after the medicines destroyed their health. So now they were less likely to recover from that surgery because their health was so destroyed. Methotrexate destroys the gut lining. That's one of the side effects, unfortunately. And so it was a travesty for me. And that's when I really started to dive into gluten. And I started doing research on causation in autoimmune disease, because at the time we were given a book called The Primer on Rheumatological Disease, which is like the Bible of what causes and, everything about autoimmune arthritis, right? And so as I actually read the book, unlike many of my other intern friends that didn't read the book, but I read the book cover to cover, highlighted, made notes. And what I found was, look, there were all these different reasons why autoimmune disease was happening. There were 4 fundamental causes. So coming to your question, well, gluten being a protein found in foods, particularly grains. So we know that food can cause autoimmune disease. And so food was one of the triggers. But in this primer, in this medical text that I was given and told, study it, read it, learn it, know it, there were other triggers. Bacterial infections were triggers. Viral infections were triggers. Fungal infections were triggers. Chemical exposures were triggers. And this was very, very clear across the medical literature as to what actually caused autoimmune disease. And what really confused me and made me frustrated was the doctors I was training under never said, this is what can cause your autoimmune disease. And they never tested for those triggers. So like there's medical testing that can be done, but it wasn't being done. What they would simply say is, we don't know why you have this autoimmune disease, but we know we can treat it, which made no sense. It's like, I don't know what causes it, but here's the magic potion or pill that will solve all your problems. It never made sense to me, but more importantly, it was irresponsible for those doctors to say, we don't know what causes autoimmune disease, when very clearly we have tons of medical evidence and research that shows that we do know what causes it. So if I simplify it, there's 4 fundamental triggers. Food is a trigger. Chemical exposure is a trigger. Microbial imbalance is a trigger. And some people would say infection, but infection's really, in my opinion, that's a word that's going away. We're really not seeing that. It's like staph aureus. We all have staph in us, but it's when that staph grows to such a point where it grows out of control and creates toxins that our body can no longer deal with. So it's more of an imbalance than what I would call an infection. But microbial imbalances are a trigger. And then the 4th series of triggers are nutritional deficits. Like there's a whole litany of research on how vitamin D deficiency can trigger or contribute to rheumatoid arthritis and type 1 diabetes and celiac disease. And so that's just one example, right? We've got 40 different essential nutrients that the body needs to repair and heal and function normally. And no one's ever looking at any of these groups of triggers. And that's where I started in my practice privately, as I left the VA hospital very disgruntled because they wouldn't allow me to investigate these triggers, even though they told me to read this book that said these were very clearly triggers. And so one of my very first patients in private practice was a little girl. She had terminal rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. She was 9 years old, and she'd been on methotrexate for 7 years. And the doctors looked at her mom one day and said, there's no more we can do for her. She's going to die, and you need to go home and get your affairs in order and prepare for her death. And so I was like the 8th specialist that this little girl, they traipsed her into my office. And what makes me mad about it is I should have been the first. Like I shouldn't have been the 8th. I should have been the first. We saved that little girl's life. She didn't die. She didn't die. She's actually gone on to graduate from college, and she's out there doing wonderful things in the world. But the way we saved her life was we identified those triggers. And one of those triggers for her was gluten, and another trigger was blueberries, of all things, the superfood, blueberries. And so when we got her off those things, her knees, which would swell up, to the size of softballs, this little tiny little girl, quit swelling up. And she had a port in her arm for pain medications embedded permanently because she was in and out of the hospital so frequently. Well, that came out of her in 6 months. Her knees quit swelling in 6 months. Within a year, she was in full remission and never went back. We never looked back. And that was my hallmark experience, the thing that said, okay, these are the things I learned in the VA hospital about triggers, but this is the application of actually measuring those triggers and saving somebody's life. And it was at that juncture that I formed the Gluten-Free Society, because I wanted this information to be widely available and freely available for anybody who was struggling with any form of autoimmune disease, but not getting answers from their traditional medicine doctor.